like to introduce our 6 gigahertz panel. If they can take the stage, and while they're taking the stage, I'll start doing a high-level overview of them. Everyone who registered for the conference will get a detailed background emailed to them of everyone's biography, and folks' biographies are substantial. And I encourage you to read them when they get sent around. Our moderator today for the 6 gigahertz panel is Steve Coran. He's a partner at Lerman Center. He's chairman of the Lerman Center Broadband Spectrum and Communications Infrastructure Practice Group. He's represented private broadband providers, private equity firms, public broadband providers, equipment technology companies, and new technology firms, serving their policy, transactional, compliance, and licensing needs. He also actively represents a trade association before the FCC, Congress, and other federal agencies in matters involving spectrum policy and internet regulation, the Universal Service Fund, and other proceedings. Again, I encourage you to read his more detailed biography, which will be sent around and posted. We also have Mark Gibson, who has over 4 decades of wireless experience. Mark is responsible.
Started when you were 5, really.
On the way to 5. And he's responsible for developing domestic and international business opportunities for CommScope in the areas of RF engineering and spectrum management, in addition to leading technical and business development efforts for numerous wireless and spectrum-related products and services. He's led efforts to address spectrum sharing between the federal government and commercial users. He leads CommScope's effort to develop, test, and certify the automated frequency coordination system for 6 gigahertz unlicensed bands. He's a board member, regulatory officer of the OnGo Alliance, and president and chair of the Wireless Innovation Forum. He also has many, many other activities. And again, I encourage you to read his biography in detail. He has a Bachelor of Science Electrical Engineering from the University of Maryland, go Terps, and is a life member of IEEE, an amateur radio operator, and an instrument-rated commercial pilot. To his left, we have Dr. Tom Willis, principal member of the technical staff of AT&T Laboratories, a longstanding NSMA board member and really hefty contributor to what we do here. Dr. Willis works in the areas of microwave wireless communications at AT&T Laboratories in Middletown, New Jersey, where he's been employed for the last 35 years. He holds a PhD in electrical engineering, specializing in electromagnetics from the University of Michigan. Dr. Willis has served as a chair of the National Spectrum Management Association's Working Group 2 on over-the-horizon propagation laws, and is currently on the NSMA board. He's also on the Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition board, serving as vice president. He's currently representing AT&T in the WinForum 6 gigahertz effort and chairs the 6 gigahertz interference task group. And last but not least, but since his last name starts with Z, he's used to this, it's David Zumwalt, president and CEO of WISPA. As of June 1st of last year, David began serving as president and CEO of WISPA, the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. WISPA's service providers are supported by vital vendors and suppliers. They deliver primary broadband connectivity in traditionally underserved and unserved suburban, rural, and tribal communities nationwide, with a growing subscriber base now reaching 9 million Americans. Prior to WISPA, he served as Chief Operating Officer of Broadband VI, a major internet service provider in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where his role included full profit and loss responsibility and had a primary mission to prepare the company to scale. In 2021, Broadband VI sought and won $84.5 million in the FCC Connect USVI funding to supplement its private investment in territory-wide network expansion. Of course, that's relevant because now we have broadband efforts throughout the United States, BEAD, RDOF, and everything else. So I'm sure David brings a deep well of experience there. I encourage you to, again, read his bio in depth. He's a graduate of Rice University. He's been named a fellow of the Radio Club of America in recognition of his wireless industry contributions, and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Texas. And I'll turn it over to Steve Cram.
Thanks, Joe. And nothing I like better than talking about spectrum at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. But I actually do kind of like talking about it. Do you all want to, Joe gave some pretty good overviews and recited your bios, but do you want to kind of add a little bit more to that and talk about maybe what you're currently doing or why you're here?
Well, yeah, I'm here because Joe invited me. And just as an aside, you know,
he told me,
yeah, it's great to be back, you know, here in front of NSMA. I mean, I remember having a conversation with Bill Lai in 1983 about standing this thing up. So that tells you how old I am. But anyhow, as you know, Joe read in the bio, at least from our perspective, my affiliation listed up there is probably Comsearch. Comsearch is part of CommScope, and a couple of years ago, CommScope bought Ruckus and Eris. So we've got interests across the entire 6 gig band. On the Comsearch side, we do frequency coordination for incumbent microwave systems as well as other things, but that's kind of where our interests lay. And so Tom and I go way back as well. Then throughout CommScope, we sell antennas in this band as well as other bands. And then the Ruckus and Eris business units, Ruckus sells wireless access points in both the unlicensed and CBRS bands. And then Eris sells access points and modems and stuff like that, primarily for the cable business. So we're interested in all aspects of this type of sharing. Our background also in dynamic sharing on the Comsearch side started with TV whitespace, which went great. And then there was CBRS, which is actually still going. Full disclosure, we decided to get out of the SaaS business just because it's hard to make money in that business. Nonetheless, we still have interest in that, again, on the Ruckus side. So I think if you look at all the companies that are involved now in a 6 gig, there's really only 2 of us, 3 of us maybe, that were involved in TV whitespace. Some of the same people even. So, and that goes back, TV whitespace started in 2007. So it's really exciting to see this mature to an automatic frequency coordinating system. I think some people will think mature is probably a strong word, but that's basically our background. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, right now I am heavily involved in the 6 gigahertz effort that's going on in the Wind Forum. The reason for that is AT&T has a fairly significant 6 gigahertz fixed service microwave network out there. We have a little over 12,000 active licensed radios out there in the band. Primarily, those are being used for cell site backhaul, but there are other applications. We have some core network enterprise access applications as well. So obviously, we're very concerned about the future of the band and how the incumbents are going to be performing there. In addition, however, just like any other new communications technology that comes out, AT&T is looking at the unlicensed use of 6 gigahertz for possible applications in our network as well. So we've kind of got, feet in both camps. This makes the work that's going on within the Wind Forum and affiliated with the Wi-Fi Alliance very important to us, and hence that's why I am there.
So I have a connection to AT&T. My grandfather and uncle were both in AT&T pre-divestiture. And I tell you that because when I announced to them that I was going to go work for a company called CompuCon years ago, they were like, why would you want to go into any kind of competitive telecommunications business? It's only AT&T. That's all going on out there. I did start my career at CompuCon. Vivian Wolfson, in fact, is the wife of Jim Wolfson, who is boss number 1 for me a long time ago. And so I've got some frequency coordination, field engineering experience going way back, 4 and 6 gigahertz band, a little bit in the early days of DBS as well. So even though I'm now involved with WISPA, I've got some background that may be relevant, more relevant to people who are in this room or who are watching. WISPA's members are deeply concerned about what's going on in licensed spectrum, unlicensed spectrum, and licensed by rule spectrum. And so we're watching all of this very closely, and we look forward to the conversation today. And one other thing that I would mention is that I am very privileged to have 2 people who work with me. Leah Peretz is our VP of Policy at WISPA, and Richard Bernhardt, who I think many of you know, is our Senior Director of Industry and Spectrum, and he is engaged on many of the activities of standard-setting bodies. He was recently injured, and so we've been playing some musical chairs with some of these roles. So if you were expecting to see someone really smart like Richard here today, I'll apologize. I'm standing in for him, but I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, great. So let's get on with the panel. The panel is called 6 gigahertz and the headlights, but I think before we kind of look at the headlights, let's take a quick look back in the rearview mirror. As Tom said, currently the band is used for point-to-point microwave, licensed for critical information infrastructure, for backhaul, for direct internet access. It acts as a fiber substitute or connecting cell sites. So it's been a very vital band for not just AT&T, but wireless ISPs and utilities for decades. In April 2020, the FCC kind of, I wouldn't say concluded a rulemaking, but put out a report in order, because they're never finished, right? Put out a report in order, and they took this 1200 megahertz between 5925 and 7125 and said, you know, what can we do to fill in these areas around these licensed point-to-point links? And how can we do that in a way that will provide interference protection to the incumbents and also future licensees, which, you know, let's not lose fact. I mean, this is still an ongoing band that's being frequency coordinated day to day. And there's sort of two flavors of 6 gigahertz. There's the indoor, which operates at low power. You might have heard of Wi-Fi 6, and that's, I think Wi-Fi 6 came along before it was 6 gigahertz, but they've become almost synonymous. And that's the sort of service that can operate without an automated frequency coordination, which we'll talk a little bit about, probably a lot about. The outdoor version is 850 megahertz split between two of the subbands, and that is subject to automated frequency coordination that is ongoing in WinForm to develop the ways in which incumbents can be protected. And since April 2020, we've seen a couple of things. One, the FCC's rules survived a court challenge. The court ruled that the FCC had justified its decision. We have ongoing AFC development and continued effort by some to claim that there's interference to the low power systems. Be very anxious to hear what you guys have to say about that. And we've seen a lot of experimental licensing in the 6 gigahertz band, especially among the wireless ISPs. And there are a number of manufacturers that are making equipment available ahead of deployment of the AFC and full commercial outdoor use on an unlicensed basis. So, and in the headlights, we're going to talk about all these things, but one thing I don't want to leave behind, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this when Scott Harris talks tomorrow, is how does this fit into the national spectrum strategy? And what is, you know, what should that strategy entail? And I think a lot of folks would suggest that our spectrum strategy going forward should involve a combination of unlicensed spectrum, licensed spectrum, and shared spectrum. And the AFC this is kind of the first time we've done it. I mean, we've done sort of TV white space, which is sort of like the analog clock of spectrum sharing. And then went to CBRS, was almost like the atomic clock of spectrum sharing. And now we're doing something called the AFC, which is kind of somewhere in between, but I'm sure that those who are more involved in it have more to share about that. So with that background, let me kind of turn to some of the questions that we've all put together here. I think we've already talked about what your organization's position is on 6 gigahertz. So maybe I'll just ask Tom, what are some of the consumer benefits? This is an easy one for you, by the way, of 6 gigahertz. And you can, since you represent kind of, you know, both sides of this, you know, the incumbent side, and also have an interest in maybe using it on an unlicensed basis, you know, what are some of the purposes that AT&T is considering?
Well, I mean, you know, obviously we're talking about a lot of spectrum here, right? I mean, for the LPI devices, you're talking about 1200 megahertz of spectrum, and for the standard power devices, it's still 850 megahertz of spectrum. So when you have that kind of spectrum, you certainly have the capabilities to use wide bandwidth channels, and that's certainly the Wi-Fi 6E standard is, you know, the standard Wi-Fi channels are 20 megahertz, but they've got, you know, 40, 80, 160, and there's even work going on with 320 megahertz channels. So when you have bandwidth like that, you can really do, you know, massive, very fast downloads. You can think about applications that have very low latency, you know, real-time applications. And again, you know, what people will ultimately decide they want to use this for, you know, we'll have to wait and see, but I've seen a lot of talk about sort of augmented reality, virtual reality. You know, you could imagine things like remote controlled surgery, where one, latency would not be good, and two, reliability is kind of important. So, I mean, these are the kinds of things that people are talking about that could be beneficial with this new application. I mean, I'm sure you guys have other ideas about what you can do with it too. So I'll let others comment.
David?
Well, I was just going to add that from the viewpoint of the operator, this is a pretty easy overlay to what WISPs already have in place. So when you think about their outside plant the infrastructure that they have in place that typically is in the 5 gig area. 6 works pretty well for that. But the point about the wide bandwidth is really important, especially in applications where people need it. We're still at a point where we're looking at a lot of consumer use, which doesn't require that much. So the additional spectrum offers the ability to infill, to do a lot of things that are not being done necessarily right now, very cost effectively with wireless. And look, one of the things I want everybody here to understand is that the Wireless ISP Association has a lot to do with wireless, but our members are deploying fiber too. They're deploying a lot of it. So we're more of a right tool for the right job kind of an organization. But wherever spectrum is available that we can use to continue to build out networks, that makes a lot of sense to us, and it makes possible the things that you're talking about, Tom.
And I could just add to that 2 things. One is basically more the same. The fixed wireless access aspect of this is a lot nicer, just because it's fairly unused in rural areas where there's not a lot of microwave. So if you think about, and actually the unlicensed use case for fixed wireless access in rural areas is perfect. So that's where you could easily get, or much more easily get, a 320 megahertz channel, and that can give you gigabit to the house wirelessly, which I, and speaking from experience, had, and for about 14 years, a wireless unlicensed link. It was a Ubiquiti 5.9 gig system, and Ubiquiti M5, I think it was, system to the house, and it was okay. But the best I could get was 80 megahertz wide channel. And now with 320 megahertz wide channel, it'll be smoking, as they say. But the other thing that's a use case that's somewhat overlooked is the higher power indoor. Standard power can be used indoor in both an access point and a client configuration. And you can't get 4 watts in the house right now in the 5.9 gig band. So in the 6 gig band, that gives you a lot more opportunity for the access point to be used essentially as a gateway for all kinds of things. It could minimize the need for a mesh or extender type of uses in the house. And so that's one use case that really is being looked at a lot by our company, because on the ARIS side, we build these things. And so we're really thinking about the higher power indoor use for a lot of those things that can enable a lot better indoor use case and experience.
So this is a spectrum management conference. So Mark, I'm going to ask you to explain how the band will be managed to prevent harmful interference, how proven is the AFC system, and how does device geolocation work, and how does the AFC use that information? Sorry for the complicated compound question, but I think you get the idea.
Yeah, so I think what we should do is set expectations, because I don't think this will prevent harmful interference. It will hopefully prevent harmful interference, but I think most of us as spectrum managers in this room have seen the docket and seen a lot of the filings put on there by incumbents, and they found corner cases where, for all intents and purposes, there's interference. So what the AFC hopes to do is, in 99.9% of the cases, and let me take a diversion for a moment. There's a sister organization called Fixed Wireless Coalition, and Mitchell Lazarus, who is brilliant, made the argument years ago on this docket that because of just the sheer number of microwave systems in the band, and you look at it just on an assignment basis, there's over 106,000 frequencies assigned in this band. So 0.1% of interference is 100 cases, and that could be an E911, PSAP, or something like that. So what the AFC tries to do is address the 99.99% of that, or whatever that number ends up being, through a process that is, and again, I'm sure we all know how it works. If you know TV white space or CBRS, it's basically the same, where the device tells the AFC where it has to determine where it is, which is a thing in and of itself. It has to be able to self-geolocate, and that can either be done using GPS, which doesn't work so well indoors. So there's a host of other mechanisms for the indoor geolocation methodology, which includes a number of things, including using a network-based geolocation methodology. And I can talk about how that gets authorized in a moment. So the device has to report to the AFC where it is, and the AFC doesn't necessarily know that the device is indoors. We can talk about that as well, but the device reports to the AFC where it is. The AFC takes that information, runs an analysis, basically like a point-to-point analysis against the incumbent database, and then comes up with the amount of available spectrum at given powers to send back to the device. And all this happens lickety-split, theoretically, maybe within a couple of seconds, but pretty quick. And then the device is supposed to operate on the spectrum and at the powers that it gives, that it's given by the AFC. And then after 24 hours, the device has to check in to make sure that that's still available. The other thing the device has to do, if the device powers off and it powers back on, or if the device moves more than some certain amount, the device then has also to check in. One aspect of geolocation that's unique to this, as opposed to, say, CBRS, is this notion of area of uncertainty. And so with each GPS, or with each fix, there's an area where the device could be. We don't know exactly where it is, so it's this sort of this cloud. And so what the AFC has to do is, when that information is reported by the device to the AFC does an analysis within this cloud. The device could be anywhere within the cloud. And that adds some additional complication, you know, but again, these things run on the cloud, on another cloud, and too many clouds, it's getting dark in here. But it runs on the computer cloud, and so it can run pretty quickly, and then so it'll send what it sends back is the frequencies that device can use anywhere within its uncertainty cloud. Then, you know, there's other sort of things that happen, and I think Steve will get into this with respect to enforcement, what happens when interference happens, but that's, you know, basically the way the AFC is supposed to work.
I will just add to Mark's comments there. The uncertainty region is one of the complications in this calculation that makes this a little more challenging, especially if you have to do, you know, if you're doing a lot of standard power devices out there, you do have to worry about computer performance. So, I mean, there's some subtleties to getting this all to work properly.
Well, and so there's 13 AFCs that have expressed interest to the commission that have been conditionally authorized by the FCC, which just means the commission's looked at our applications and said, okay, you know how to spell AFC, so you can move on to the next phase. I mean, the bar's pretty low, but I mean, we will all go through, AFCs will all go through a testing and certification phase, which we're on the precipice of. But Tom makes a really good point. The geolocation is not trivial. And as we know, GPS doesn't work very well indoors. And so what do? Cell phones work pretty well indoors, but cell phones are connected to a network. So there's been, if you look at the docket, there's been 3 proposals. We put 2 of them on the docket. One of them was by HPE on methods to use that are using a combination of some multilateration, which is basically time division of arrival methodologies that are inherent with 802.11, which is really kind of cool. Basically just transmission time. And then they use third-party geolocation tools like Google Earth. There's this one I just learned of called What 3 Words, which is weird, but it's a geolocation tool, and then there are others. And again, we'll get into this, I think, in a minute. The challenge is convincing the commission that this is all workable, which the commission put on the device guys. And so I think that's where this is going to have to be, you know, looked into.
So from a purely simplistic perspective, at least you know where these point-to-point links are and they don't move around, 1. And 2, we're not dealing with the Navy like we were in CBRS, but we are dealing with the public safety community. And, you know, it's taken a while for the AFC to sort of develop. What are your thoughts? I mean, is it going as you thought it would, or more slowly? Oh, I guess it always goes more slowly than we would like, right?
Well, it's not going faster than I thought it would, or slower than I thought it would. You know, just by comparison, again, we talk about TV white space and CBRS, and all of them had their inherent issues. TV white space being the first. Actually, TV white space was the second. Some of us in this room might remember something that American Personal Communications rolled out in this market called frequency agile sharing technology, which was a database-enabled method that used a combination of sense and avoid. The device would sense frequency. It would use the database to determine, if I sense this frequency, I'm at this location, I know where the other end is. APC, which ultimately got acquired by Sprint, which got acquired by Verizon, won what's called a pioneer preference. So they got some special bidding credits on that. So that was the first. The rest of them are pretty much like that. But TV white space took 4 years from the day the commission issued the public notice inviting proposals to the day they issued the public notice saying, you know, here's the approved ones. CBRS took 4. And we're not even a year into this yet. So we're moving at light speed compared to the past. It's not even fast enough for the people that have devices that have pent up. But I think what the commission is doing is taking a required, very measured approach on this, because they're the ones who are going to get the incoming reports of interference, and they want to make sure they have this worked out. Because we're getting out even with CBRS. CBRS is not interference free for all intents and purposes. So I think that, you know, that's in setting expectations. I think that AFCs will be certified probably, don't quote me on this. Of course you will, but sometime in October based on the latest conversations with the commission. And so that'll be roughly a year from the commission's public notice. So they're moving faster, but still not as fast as people want them to go.
So I want to come back to that in a second, but Mark, you hit on a couple of things. One is, you know, thoughts on interference reporting and resolution might work within the industry, and how the FCC will deal with incumbent interference if it's detected, or what other mechanisms is the AFC going to be responsible for enforcing it? And I'll let all three of you guys.
Because I'm really want to hear what Tom say about this, but what the commission is thinking about doing, and let's go back again to TV white space. You know, that ban was TV bans, and the potential interference was into TV stations or TV sets. And there was really very little facility for reporting interference there. In the end, there's only 300 devices deployed, and so very little chance of interference. In CBRS, though, SAS is the Spectrum Access System Administrator, spent a lot of time with the Enforcement Bureau working out how you do enforcement in this paradigm of having a centralized dynamic spectrum management system that operates basically under authority by the commission, but is somewhat autonomous from enforcement. I think that, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that sets up some interesting enforcement issues just in terms of what happens there. Take those off the table for a minute. There's just the practice of doing that. So what we did with CBRS was we agreed with the commission that we would do kind of two things. One, we developed a portal and made it public for anybody to report, incumbents other than the Navy to report interference. The other thing we did is we agreed with the commission that if any interference reports came into the Enforcement Bureau, the commission could reach out to SASs, and then the SASs would send them information on location devices in a certain location. So what they do is either they give us a bounding box or a point radius. And I got a report on Friday, the commission asking about devices in a certain area. And then what they'll do is they'll go and they'll do their enforcement thing in those areas and try to find where interference happens. And for the most part, this is probably interference into other CBRS devices. Very little, we have gotten 0 reports of interference into the Navy. In 6 gigahertz, the commission is still thinking about what to do. And in talking with the commission, I think that the public notice that we're waiting for to get us into the next phase, which is actually the certification, they'll put a little bit of information in there on how they would like to do interference, seeking feedback from the AFCs on how the AFCs can support that. But at the end of the day, you know, the licensees in the band, you know, which AT&T I think is the primary licensee, not primary, but has, you know, probably more links than anybody, at least them and Verizon. Their licenses are issued by the commission, and they want to report interference to the commission. They don't want to do any stinking AFC, because an AFC can't really react to an incumbent's report. And that's something we have to sort out. So if Tom called me as an AFC provider and says, I'm getting reports of interference. First, we don't know that it's not coming from low power, which are not part of the AFC. So how do we deal with that? And second, we don't know it's devices that we're managing because we don't share information among AFCs like we do in CBRS. So that means Tom is either going to call 13 AFCs or one commission. And so I can pretty much tell you what he's going to call. Their number is an 800 number, and they've got a reporting mechanism. So this is a lot to be sorted out, that the commission, you know, fortunately we're going to do a crawl, walk, run thing. So not, you know, there won't be millions of devices on day one. So we have time to work this out, but we're going to have to work it out. So I'm curious to hear what you think about it from, you know, with the parade of horribles that I'm sure you guys have been thinking about.
Right. So, and I agree, Mark, this is a challenging problem that I don't think we've got sorted out yet. There's certainly provisions in the report and order from the FCC saying that the FCC can tell an AFC system, you got to shut down people on a certain set of frequencies in a certain geographic area, but exactly how, you know, what's going to trigger the FCC to do that is kind of unclear at this point. Now, this is a topic that people have talked about. I mean, the 6 gigahertz multi-stakeholder group that the FCC asked to be set up to look at things has had a work stream 1 write a paper addressing this particular question. If you go and read that document, there's a lot of useful and good information in there, but you also see there's also a pretty diverse set of opinions about how this should work. So, I mean, it's not like all the issues were resolved based on that paper. So, yeah, I mean, so things are kind of like Mark says. I think we're going to have to get some experience and figure out how this is going to work. I mean, you got to appreciate the fact that the Enforcement Bureau at the FCC has got finite resources, right? I mean, so we can't come up with some system that's going to just like make their workload go up by a factor of 100. I mean, that's not going to work. So, I mean, the industry is going to have to like figure out how we interact with the FCC so that the incumbents can, report things. Maybe they set up a portal to report things, and then have AFC systems be able to react to these things. But I think it's a really important issue, but I just don't think it's solved at this problem at this point. I don't think we have agreement on how this is going to work.
Nope.
So that kind of raises a different question, and that's device security, right? Because if the AFC works perfectly and the devices work perfectly, then we're never going to have an interference complaint, right?
Well, perfectly means worked as intended.
Right.
And we're all spectrum managers, so there's no such thing as no interference. We deal in the world of harmful interference, which is different things to different people. But in terms of just setting expectations, there will be interference. I mean, there is now, because we send guys out to measure interference all the time. But as a premise for a conversation,
right,
I think you're right. I mean, if AFCs work as they're supposed to, and low power indoor devices work as they're supposed to, and there's always 22.5 dB of building entry loss, and contention-based protocols work, there will never be any interference, and AFCs will be used, for the next thing. So I have plenty to do.
Well, good. Glad the AFC is the Mark Gibson Full Employment Act.
Yeah.
So, David, let me turn to you. As I mentioned at the top, the FCC has approved a number of experimental licenses in the 6 gigahertz band for outdoor devices. We've seen reports and press releases from some, as Mark said before, that they're getting gigabit download speeds with some of the equipment that's being manufactured. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what WISPA members are doing in the band.
They are. We have several equipment manufacturers that are providing equipment in the band already for the experimental use. We have several WISPA operator members who are using it as well, and they are seeing these sorts of performance indicators, gigabit down, near gigabit up capabilities. And so I want to sort of tie this into the AFC conversation as well. It's fascinating to reflect on 40 years of a career and see how we've gone through a system where it seems like spectrum is static and it doesn't ever change. And now we're looking for ways to incorporate new uses in existing spectrum. And I'm confident that, based on the experience that our members are having, that this is going to be something that will work, even if it takes us a little while to work it out.
I've been monitoring those just to keep track of what's happening. And, early on, before the advent of the radios, there was not a lot of activity. A lot of it was just sort of basically science projects. Now, every day, there's a couple of filings. And I think a lot of those are testing out equipment. Many of the equipment providers are actually providing a sort of a template for operators to file. And if you read that, they're using it to verify that equipment works, properly. Also testing propagation. This is a higher band than 5.8, not that much higher, but if you get further up against the bottom of it, up in the 6,400 megahertz realm, it's a little different. So they're testing a lot of those things. And fortunately, the commission's put conditions on the authorization as opposed to the filing that they need to coordinate. And although those are not consistent, generally they're saying a Part 101-like coordination. And now I think most of them are doing it. So it's interesting to watch it because most of the equipment manufacturers are supporting it.
I think for the fixed wireless community, because they've been so active in the 5 gigahertz bands over the years, and it's become, fairly congested, that, the manufacturers are now looking for other spectrum, as the operators are as well. And they're leveraging, even though it is, Uni 6, 7, 8, they are able to leverage the technology and just, I make it sound easy, but just slap an AFC on it and, fine, we're all good to go. But, from a propagation standpoint and from a you know, it's a lot of the same DNA, and that's what makes it, I think, attractive for a lot of folks to want to use it on an unlicensed basis, understanding the risks associated with someone like AT&T or Verizon or public safety or utilities, you know, putting new links up. And, you know, you don't really have much to say about that if somebody, you know, puts a point-to-point beam right through your 320 megahertz channel.
Well, Steve, one of the things I'd like to add to that is that, you know, members of our association are using the 6 gig band and point-to-point links as well. So they're already using the licensed band, and so adding 6 gig as something that they can use to further deploy their network, there's some self-policing that's going on just there. The last thing they want to do is offer something that's going to improve service while they're messing with their own backhauls.
Well, that's a good lead into best practices, because best practices means being good stewards of the spectrum and ensuring that you don't, you know, that the device is secure and that you're able to build networks that, that people can rely on. And I'm going to give all of you kind of an opportunity to talk about what do you see as best practices in the band from equipment side, AFC side, or the operator side, depending on your perspective.
Start with David.
All right, well, I was sort of, you know, indicating it or implying it just a minute ago. With multiple uses of the same band, it's something that operators have to kind of keep straight. Within the equipment manufacturer community, our vendor community, they're doing the same thing. They're wanting to make sure that they can bring equipment, you know, to the industry in a way that's going to anticipate and work with the AFC or other systems that, you know, might emerge. I think, you know, best practices, though, thinking about it from an operator perspective, because I want to offer something that might be a little different than what the other panelists are going to be saying. They're already operating, especially in unlicensed spectrum realms, in an environment where there could be interference, there could be congestion, and so they're having to work through that already. They're having to coexist with other competitors or other uses of the spectrum, in the case of the 5 gig spectrum in particular. So the best practice you know, aspect that they're involving or they're employing is one that's looking at how can we be good stewards without triggering something that's going to be an enforcement action or something where we have complaints from an existing, you know, licensed user of the band. From an operator perspective, I think that's really important because, you know, this is a delightful opportunity to gain additional spectrum for their existing outside plant. They don't want to screw that up.
Yeah, so I mean, and I agree with all those comments. I mean, the you know, from a best practices standpoint, I think we want to, you know, conform to standards that are developed, like in the WIN Forum, also with the Wi-Fi Alliance. Also, we've got, you know, recommendations that come out of NSMA on how to do these things. And I you know, think, you know, NSMA has a history, certainly a long history of coming up with recommendations that are generally considered best practices in the industry to follow for the, you know, the point-to-point fixed service regime. But I would like to point out something additionally, which is traditionally the fixed service microwave users have not had to deal with the type of interference that they are going to see from the unlicensed devices, right? I mean, typically, prior to having the unlicensed devices in the band, you had other fixed service providers that you've got to coordinate with. And the interference you're going to get from those guys is pretty much on all the time. I mean, if it's there, it's just going to be there, right? So because those radio systems just are, they come on and they transmit all the time. The unlicensed devices, on the other hand, are very sporadic transmitters, right? I mean, they transmit in small bursts. If people aren't particularly using the system in a given area at a point in time, it might not be, you know, transmitting anything other than beacon signals for hours, and then all of a sudden comes on and it's got a huge burst of energy that it's transmitting, which, you know, if that's interfering, you're going to see an interference event when that happens. So one of the things that's going on in the industry is the folks that build the incumbent point-to-point radios are working on, you know, setting up software and setting up mechanisms in those radios where they can, you know, detect that, oh, this is interference, and the characteristics of it look like, you know, a Wi-Fi 6E device, and be able to report that to the incumbents. Now, how the incumbents are going to use that information and work with the FCC and AFC systems to correct those situations is yet to be seen. But that is something that, and it's going to take a while for that to roll out, right? I mean, we've got 100,000 radios out there, and they're not going to all upgrade tomorrow with new software. So it's going to happen over time. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's going to evolve over time as more and more these devices go into the band, and that the radios get a little bit smarter about how to detect interference from them.
I think, best practices is pretty broad, so I think it depends upon what role you're in. So I guess starting with the device people, I'd say from that standpoint, and again, bottom line, these are all underpinned by following the rules. But the rules are really not a touchstone. Think, for example, what does indoors mean? It's pretty safe to say this is indoor, but what is a stadium? And what is an arena? Because our company is dealing with this. The Commission for Low Power Indoors set several conditions on being able to put low power, on limiting low power indoor to indoor. But when you put it, if you have a stadium like Texas Stadium or AT&T Stadium in Dallas, which are a stadium with a roof, does that mean when the roof is open, it's outdoor, and the roof is closed, it's indoor? And what does that mean all the time? And talking to the Commission, I doubt they're going to come out with an opinion on, okay, that's indoor, okay, look up the list on the Commission, this is what's indoor or outdoor. So when you think of best practices for deploying these devices, I would implore device manufacturers or those that deploy them to look to the spirit of the rules as opposed to just, okay, well, indoors could be anything. Because the idea is to take advantage of building entry laws to prohibit or prevent things from transmitting without a line of or transmitting line of sight. From AFC perspective, again, the Commission is leaving a lot to us, which is great. And those companies run the gamut from companies like us, Google, and others to startups. And just not to say that there's anything wrong with a startup, but we all have to follow the same rules, and we can't just try to get by on the skin of our teeth. The Commission is going to run us through a certification program, that's great, but we all have to commit to making sure that our AFC systems evolve as things change and need to, and so we have to commit to doing that as well. And I'd say there's others best practices, but I see the time is done, and I think with Joe standing there, we're done.
Well, let me just put a cap on that.
Okay.
And there's a lot at stake here because this is the AFC and that's being deployed for the first time in a band, but it's also a potential model for other bands as we talk about national spectrum strategy and other spectrum that may be made available where there are incumbents that can't be relocated, or the cost is too high, or it will take too long, or that's just not what the policy is, for a variety of reasons. So it's important to nail this, and it's important for people to act in a responsible way because we want to make sure we can do something like this again and make more spectrum available on a reliable and responsible basis. Joe?
I do think we have time for one question if there's anyone in the audience has one, or I do have one that came in remotely, but we would prefer give preference to the live audience. Pat McKay. So what Pat I think was asking was, because utilities are experiencing interference now, there's some experimental licensees that are causing persistent havoc with law enforcement and other systems, and they're not, I think, being addressed adequately by either indoor and, of course, outdoors coming. Tom mentioned that the FCC can't deal with a 100% increase in enforcement off the cuff. So how are we going to handle this when state police, law enforcement, utility management, somebody needs to open the Hoover Dam or it's going to break, we can't have interference. How are we going to handle this as an industry? I guess, is that your question, Connor? Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think you should ask the Commission. I mean, if anybody's going to be from the Commission, that's a good question, because one thing that we haven't talked about is the Commission had a notice of inquiry on the receiver standards back in the fall, and then they had a policy statement that came out recently about what they're going to do. And the one thing they said is that incumbents should not expect interference-free operation across the board, even public safety and critical infrastructure. So I don't know what that means. I'm sure that's open to interpretation. So I think it says we're all going to have to expect some level of interference. So I think that the days of interference-free operation are over. Now, we've all built systems to accommodate interference-free operation or something like that. So when you see the noise floor come out or things happen and your bit error rate goes up, you're getting interfered with. So I think we got to put that on the side and say, okay, FCC, how do we deal with that? But when it comes to enforcement, I have always been concerned about the role of the process of enforcement in the context of this new paradigm we have, dynamic spectrum management systems. What do? Do you put it on the AFCs? So now you put the AFC in a position of turning in their customers. That's not going to work, or not very well. So this really has to be sorted out, and I think we can't wait till interference happens and a PSAP call doesn't go through or whatever. One way we did this in CBRS is we have an interference protection criteria for the radars that is, you'll never breach that, even with aggregation. So that's working great. That's not what we have here. I over N of -6 is pretty much bare minimum. So I think it's frankly, my opinion, and this is just Mark's opinion, I won't speak for the company, it's not sorted out just yet, and we're going to have to spend more time working on it.
I'd like to sound at least a hopeful tone, looking at what the industry is doing in the 5 gig band. The vendors in particular are going to town on things that they're doing to mitigate interference in unlicensed spectrum realms. So whether it's beamforming, it's controlling power, things that they're doing to make sure that receivers are talking and listening at the appropriate times. I think some of these technologies will be showing up, or these approaches will be showing up even in the 6 gig band, because this is a precious resource. No one wants to squander it. No one wants to waste it. I think we're going to see the vendor community step up and help with this. So there will be enforcement actions, but it's not going to be the wild, wild west forever. So whatever's happening experimentally, I think that's all going to get solved.
One thing that I found interesting listening here is that, the SAS for CBRS is there's information sharing among the SASs. Yeah. And here there isn't. And that's a real material difference here. Yeah. That I think people need to understand. And the notion that Tom floated about a portal or some, way to kind of find the source of the interference without having to, send emails to 13 different AFCs is, something that I think everybody should be very interested in. That may be a great way. There may be ways to improve on that. Maybe the AFCs could have some way to share information that would seem to be, as long as everybody's signed off, because there are, privacy concerns and so forth. So I'll be interested to see how we work through these problems.
Well, the WIN Forum, I think that somebody mentioned it in passing, Wireless Innovation Forum has dealt with standing up the standards for development of the AFC. And one of the things we did was we put together in the mid-band, 3.1 to 3.8, a sort of an interference reporting portal, just to say, hey, look, if you're getting interference, here's a portal. It's basically a SurveyMonkey survey, bunch of questions, and if you're getting interfered with, let us know what's happening, across the mid-bands. So we've thought about whether we could or should stand up one. We can, but whether we should stand up one for 6 gigahertz. Key things are, what are we going to do with it, and what's any liability associated with the WIN Forum on managing that? Because for all intents and purposes, it would be sort of a private effort. But we've begun the discussion, and we think we're going to carry it forward because we think we can play a role in the WIN Forum to kind of help manage that, maybe be a clearinghouse or something like that. So that might be something that comes out of the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you all, wisdom keepers at 6 gigahertz. I want to give a round of applause for Steve Coran, Mark Gibson, Dr. Tom Willis, and David Zumwalt. Thank you all.